if you're going to be doing this, you're going to be spending all this time and money and resources to open a business in the United States and get an e-visa. Make sure you really understand what these things mean, what it means to be at funds at risk, what source of funds, how important that is, that you had possession and control of them, before you invested. Hire somebody, consult with somebody who knows all of these things and the intricacies, the ins and outs of what could be problematic and how to deal with that through the process.
Patrick Findaro here, co-founder at Visa Franchise. Excited to have on today Steven Lawson, who used to be part of the e-visa staff at the U.S. Consulate in Toronto, one of the posts that sees the most E2 visas issued every year. Steven, thanks so much for joining us at Visa Franchise.
Oh, thank you for having me, Patrick.
Steven, I'd love to hear about the work that you did at the U.S. Consulate in Toronto, specifically with the E2 visas. I know you handled other categories like the E1, and just kind of your trajectory and what got you so interested that you decided to continue on working with the e-visas.
Oh, absolutely. So this all started back in 2014 when my wife got offered a promotion and an opportunity to go to Toronto with the company that she worked for. It's basically the Canadian version of an L1, intra-company transfer. And I found myself in a new country, new city, didn't know anybody. It was kind of a unique opportunity for me to sort of reinvent myself, start something different and try something different. And that's something I've always gravitated towards. So I started looking for jobs, and I came across a position I saw at the U.S. Consulate. And I thought it'd be very interesting, being a U.S. citizen who's now going through the Canadian immigration process, to learn a little bit about U.S. immigration. I knew nothing about it, even though I do have a legal background.
From a law school, right? University of Florida.
Yeah, exactly. And so I applied, and they interviewed me, but didn't hire me. I applied again, and they interviewed me and didn't hire me. And finally, the third time, I applied for what was at the time a summer internship program that they no longer have. That was actually the last year they had that, and they hired me. Okay. My position was only supposed to be for a few months, but I quickly, absorbed as much as I could, and I learned. I took every opportunity that was presented to me to learn about the immigration system. I was offered a permanent position and quickly transferred over to the e-visa team, which is a small team of 4 local staff and 1 consular officer that specializes and deals only with E1 and E2 visas. It's considered kind of like a specialty group. And I was very excited for the challenge. It was something I was very interested in. And I started working, and my job was to, among other things, was to analyze the e-visa applications that were presented to us and prepare reports and give advice as to whether or not they were issuable. And if they weren't, what the problem was, basically. So I studied every day. I took it kind of more as an education than a job, and figured this was an opportunity for me to get a unique insight into how the U.S. government, and one of the most prestigious, busiest adjudication posts for E1 and E2 visas, looks at various things. And, over time, I became somebody who was looked at as very knowledgeable. I started being assigned special projects. And then eventually, it got to where the most complicated and most difficult cases were directed directly to me.
Kicked up to you.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the process for consular officers is, they rely heavily on local staff, because the consular officer, they rotate in and out, and they're never in the e-visa team more than 1 year. So they rely heavily on the experience, the institutional knowledge that we as the local team that are there for years on end gain. I got to the point where I was giving advice on tricky situations, and the consular officers would send it in to DC, to their special analysts, to do what are called advisory opinions, AOs. And that provided guidance to consular officers for these complicated issues. And it got to the point where every single time I gave my opinion, it was backed up by the advisory opinion people. So, I kind of I call myself an expert. I know that can be construed in a lot of different ways, but it made me feel like I was kind of inside the mind of what the U.S. government's looking for. And I figured out how it is that they deal with all kinds of different issues that pop up. And during my time there, I worked on over 3,000 cases. I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,300. So I saw a very broad
Those are mostly
array.
investors, or is it a mix of also essential employees?
It's a mix of essential employees and investors. But of those 3,300, those are all investors. So,
Okay.
you would get applications that had investors and employees at the same time. But yeah, the 3,300 that I worked on were all new cases or renewal cases where the actual investor themselves were applying.
A question that we get all the time, and it's a bit contentious when you talk to immigration attorneys, consultants, people in the E2 visa space. But what's your opinion on the substantial investment amount? Do the consular officers have kind of a number in mind, or does it really depend on the type of business?
That's a great question, Patrick. And I get asked that question not only by prospective clients, but by other professionals all the time. And what I can tell you is this from my experience working at the U.S. Consulate in Toronto. And we did do some cross sort of training and consultations with other posts in different countries. But, obviously there's this $100,000 you hear floating around all the time. That's an example that's given in the regulations. It's definitely not the minimum you can have.
Sure.
$50,000, you're doing pretty well. Once you get down around 30,000, it's kind of, think of it like a sliding scale, right? As you progress with lower amounts of investment, it's more critical that you do a really, really, really thorough job educating that consular officer that this is an appropriate amount of investment for this particular type of business in this particular industry. So I did see several cases when I was working there that were issued that were under 30,000. I also saw quite a few that were denied that maybe could have easily been argued that they should have been approved. And it's important to remember that, like I said, these consular officers rotate. So every year you have some different person with different background, different perspectives, different ideas, making these decisions. And one of the things that consular officers kind of like lean on is that if they do refuse a case and maybe later on realize, wow, that may have been issuable, there is no direct path to having any kind of a appeal or anything like that. But the applicant can reapply. And I think this is something where I always tell my clients, when we get below 50,000, we need to really have a very, very solid application that explains that that is a significant amount of money compared to that particular business. I'm working right now with somebody who's in IT, and consultants and photographers and companies like that were the ones that generally ran into that kind of a problem.
Yeah,
And
you could get going with 20K, and maybe
yeah,
you've already sustained success in Canada or the UK, and you have a track record. We also have a lot of e-commerce entrepreneurs that they already have like $1 million business in the US, and they started it with like very little money, and they just kept on rolling the profits, the gains over to grow.
yeah, absolutely. And all that is evidence that will help support that this is a real and operating business that should be issued, despite the fact that the relatively low in investment amount.
Steven, what other factors are the E2 visa staff, the consulate staff looking at for when they approve or deny a case?
One of the big issues in visas, U.S. visa adjudication overall, is the concern for fraud. Fraud is always a factor that pops up all the time. So there are Google searches that are done, especially with E1s. I would always Google them just to see, if all these things that they're saying about themselves are true.
Yeah.
For E2s, especially if they have a physical location, and we understand Google Maps isn't always updated, but go to Google Maps and just see if that is an industrial area, or if it's an area that like makes sense that someone is there. It's pretty rare that we come across an actual case where somebody is being fraudulent, but it's important to make sure that when you go into that interview, that as the investor, you know your business. You can talk intelligently about it. You can explain it. You can talk about the industry. And the more knowledgeable you are about it, the shorter your interview is going to be. You really want to convince that officer that, hey, I take this seriously. This is my business. I understand it. I know how it works. And I know what needs to be done to make sure that it's successful.
And in terms of the kind of the more straightforward, less complicated cases, is there a type of business case that generally is easier for the consular officer and staff to kind of wrap their head around for the E2 visa, that it's, less complicated interview process or adjudicating?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the cases where you basically have, a bunch of invoices showing how much you purchase for your equipment, or if you purchase an existing business, those are really the simplest ones. I mean, you basically have a purchase and sale agreement, you have some a closing statement and some funds being transferred. You can easily show where that came from. Maybe you hire an attorney to do some corporate work for you. Business plan is always a very important thing. And, the consular officer can look at that and you can see the history of the previous owners, that it was real and operating and that they were making money. So that's really the easiest way to do it is if you're purchasing an existing business or, you have years and years or decades of experience in a particular thing. And you just essentially you're opening an office in the United States is what you're doing.
And yeah, that leads to another point where we have more and more clients that are just transferring their business from abroad to the US. And whether it's transferring irrevocably their IP or 500K worth of customer contracts and putting that into the US entity, is that kind of common, or is that straightforward for the consular officer, those kind of transfer of corporate assets to the new US entity?
Yes, absolutely. So the best way to handle that and the way I deal with it with my clients is have an independent valuation done. So hire an appraiser that is
Yeah.
experienced and knowledgeable in whatever type of equipment you have for IP. Make sure you find someone that really understands that industry. Get an independent valuation, and that counts as part of your investment.
And what do you see in terms of like the marginality requirements? Because I hear mixed things, especially going into the renewal, where if you have 20 employees and you're only making 20K net profit a year, could be okay. But if you just have two employees and you're making 20K, then maybe it doesn't pass the marginality test. How do you see that? Like, does the consulate staff usually look at that marginality requirement?
Well, historically, during my tenure, which was 2015 to 2022, historically, the way that was looked at was the consular officers generally don't really care how much the investor's making. But if you have employees, and again, it's not a requirement, but you have employees, they want to make sure they're getting paid a fair wage. And they want to make sure that the company is still operating and generating some sort of revenue, even if you're not yet profitable. I would always encourage maybe a little bit in the letter explaining why you're not profitable. I know a lot of businesses reinvest their first 4, 5, even 6 years or more
Yeah,
back into
especially in
their
the tech
business.
space.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe you're expanding. Maybe you plan on expanding or doing improvements to whatever your business is. So yeah, I've seen marginality be, like you said, 20, even negative sometimes after 5 years. But it's just something you want to explain. There is no interview generally for renewals, so it's something you want to
Yeah.
explain in the cover letter.
And then for Canada, you can renew, from what I understand, a different consular post. You don't necessarily have to, send it to Toronto.
I'm not aware of a change in that. Toronto is required do you have to file in Toronto for all
Initial.
new and renewals? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I
Employees
guess
and
now that you don't have an interview requirement, doesn't it's probably cleaner than sending it to Montreal or one of the other consular posts that you might have had to go for that renewal interview.
yeah, exactly. The renewal interview is great because let's say you're in Vancouver, you just mail your passports in and, you wait for them to mail them back to you, essentially. There's no interview requirement.
And of those 3,300 or so investor E2s, what percent roughly were third party nationals, where maybe they were in the US on a B1, B2, getting the business going, or maybe the consulate, maybe it was during COVID and Chile wasn't processing E2s or Colombia wasn't for 2 years. What percent didn't have a tie to Canada, but were still applying for the E2 visa in Toronto?
Yeah, I wish I would have kept track of that. I really do. I did keep track of some things, but if I had to just guess off the top of my head, I would say probably around 20 to 25% were
That's
third
significant.
country nationals. It was definitely significant. And like you said, the typical scenario was that you enter on your B1 and you're not from Canada and you're working on getting your business and it's a 1 hour flight or 2 hour flight from wherever your business is to Toronto and maybe you got to fly halfway around the world, or you got to fly, 5 time zones to try to renew your or get your application in your home country. So Toronto definitely does accept them. There really isn't any difference in the way that they adjudicate them. However, it's important to understand and remember that the E2 visa is authorized by a trade treaty between the country of the person's nationality and the United States. So sometimes there are some unique little differences between, for example, NAFTA and the UK. UK was one that had the treaty required that you show you have
Residency
residency.
requirement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So so it could be a little bit different depending, but TCNs, third country nationals are just treated just like everybody else.
For someone like in terms of like the process, like how does it work with the biometrics? Then they have to have a courier pick up the passport. How does it work for someone? Or do you recommend they just go to Toronto for 2 weeks, whatever time, and just spend it up there?
Yeah, that's a really good question because what the consulate does, you have to send in your passport. If you have been issued previously in Toronto, they could reuse your biometrics.
Nice.
There's a way to do that. I don't believe it works from other posts. I remember there was always some issues sometimes, or if it was a different visa category. But definitely, if you're renewing for the same category, they won't mail your passport back to any address outside of Canada. So you definitely have to be there, and it can take 2 weeks. Usually, E's are a little bit quicker. I know pre-COVID, sometimes they were ready the next day or within 2 or 3 days. But that's changed. I've been keeping a very close eye on the adjudication numbers for E2s with Toronto, and they have skyrocketed in the past. Well, it's really since we came out of COVID. I think they're averaging somewhere over 500 or 600 a month now, and it used to be somewhere about half that, about 250, 300.
Yeah, it seems like COVID's really changed the game. And you mentioned the IT professionals. We've had many IT professionals move down to the US. Maybe the spouse invests in a franchise and they have work authorization. And depending where they're moving, wages can be double, Toronto compared to the Bay Area. Obviously, costs are a little higher in San Fran, but it seems like COVID's really, affected, the migration in some way where there's a lot more flexibility now and people are able to move for whatever reason they might have stateside.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I would say probably the majority of my clients are people that they're not looking to close down their Canadian business. They're looking to expand. They've hit a revenue ceiling. Their revenues has been kind of stagnant for the past few years. That they're very successful, and right across, you can almost see from Toronto, depending on where you are. If you're up on a top of a building or something, you could see New York. So you have this huge market over there, and like you said, in some of these places, earnings and salaries can be significantly higher than what they have where they're at now.
Steven, you mentioned the key, in the interview, come prepared, know your business, study the business plan, and really own it. This is your life. This is your
Mm-hmm.
business. You're coming to the US to direct and develop the C2 visa business. Any other kind of interview tips you have for people that are looking to apply for the E2 visa?
Yes. Answer the question being asked. Don't go on a big rant or explanation or start talking about things that aren't relevant to what you're being asked. These interviews are scheduled very close together. Typically, when you walk up to that window, that consular officer has a pretty good idea of what they're going to do. So if they start asking you questions, and they're kind of like looking at their computer screen, doing whatever, typing stuff, you're probably in a very good position. So if they ask you a question, answer the question. Where people start getting into problems is when they start going on about something else, and they're like, "Oh, what was that? What did you say? Oh, let's talk about this now." And so just answer the question, keep it simple, just be professional, and let them decide what they want to ask. Don't tell them what you want them to know. Because it's probably something that they don't care about, or they just doesn't have anything to do with what they're looking for.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that. Sadly, years back, we had a client go in, wasn't properly prepped, and they had a green card petition through the EB-5 also in parallel, but it just wasn't relevant. And basically, in the consular's mind, it seemed like they were trying to get the EB-5 there at the interview. So they got denied the E2 and had to reapply and go through this whole process, months and months of, the families in limbo where if it was, properly prepped and they just answered the question asked and they knew really what their immigration plan was and take ownership. And yeah, the lawyer is there to advise, but really the investors got to have ownership over the entire process.
Absolutely. In my years there working on countless interviews, I've seen people talk themselves into getting an e-visa, and I've seen people talk themselves out of getting an e-visa. And um, it's absolutely true. Like focus on what it is you're there for. Talk about what it is you're there for. They have access to everything that you do. There's like 7 or 8 different agencies that are feeding these officers information. So they know about your EB-5 position. They know about whatever else, the travels to the United States, your previous visas. So if that's not a problem, they're not going to ask you about it. So don't go into it. There's no reason to.
And it also seems very important, to be truthful. And we've had, I can think of one case at least where it was disclosed last minute to the immigration attorney that there was a criminal issue, and that how the petition was prepared and how they would have prepped for the interview, would have been different. Thank God, he or she still got the E2 visa, but that kind of material information needs to be, with your advisor, disclosed so it can be properly presented and probably prepared, as the interview is most likely going to be more difficult and probably pry into that issue.
Absolutely, Patrick. I've had a couple of instances where that's happened. Where when I do my initial screening, I always ask my prospective clients, do you have any issues with immigration? Do you have any issues with any kind of criminal, even if it was dismissed or expunged or whatever? No, no, no. And then okay, we're ready to file. Oh, I have this, and I'm like, there's specific documents you need. I can tell you exactly what they are, but if you don't have them right now, it could take, weeks or even months. If we do this at the beginning, then we can have all that stuff set up and ready to go. It's very, very rare that there's any kind of criminal issue that prevents you from getting a visa. You may have to
It
get a
seems like a
waiver.
delay. We also had another
Yeah.
case where someone had an unpaid parking speeding violation, like 20 miles over, didn't go to court, and like
hmm
forgot about it 15
And
years. And that
there's a
delayed the
warrant out.
process like 6 months because they had to resolve that and then go back in for the E2 interview.
Absolutely. It just delays everything. And if you do it right at the beginning, because I know, from the time that my clients hire me to the time they actually get their visas, it's 6 months to a year, sometimes even more, depends on the client. And so,
Probably the
that's
business
plenty of
credit and
time to
everything.
deal with those. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And what are some of the most common questions that applicants should be prepared to answer?
Yeah, that's a good one. Any question about your business is always something you should be aware of. But things like, what are you going to do about health insurance? Especially here in Canada, we have a single payer system where health insurance, people have it as a supplement, but you don't need it for major things. So, think about stuff like that, and what do you plan on doing about your business in Canada? So if you have a business in Canada or where your home country and you're going to be operating that and going back and forth between your business in the United States, how do you plan on managing that? Stuff like that. I can't think of anything really off the top of my head. One issue that did come up back when I was working there was the issue of what source of funds with getting loans from family members.
Okay.
Loans from family members were always a problem because there were concerns about whether the money was at risk. And I can remember a case that I was working on. It was a good case. They had a lawful loan agreement with, drafted by some attorney, you could tell, and had all the terms. There were default provisions where if you didn't pay, that you would be subject to being taken to court and all that kind of stuff. And it was a woman who had borrowed from her parents. And at the interview, they were asking her about that. And one of the officers kind of like asked her, well, what happens if you don't pay back this money? What are your parents going to do? They're not going to sue you. And she's like, oh no, they're not going to sue me. And they denied her because they said the money was not at risk. So, be careful about things that seem like they're okay. Make sure you really discuss this with whoever you're working
And it
with to
seems
make
almost like
sure.
fraudulent. Yeah, no, I don't know if the word's fraudulent, but the contract says like there's these provisions, and even though it's between family members, she's saying like, oh no, it's not going to be like the contract. We're going to
Right.
just operate outside of that.
So even if she was wrong, even if her parents were going to sue her, she had this belief, and the natural conclusion that an officer is going to make is that there was like a behind, like don't worry, we're not going to sue you if you don't pay us back, kind of a thing, and which which is flies in the face of being at risk. And so, just make sure you really, really, really understand what these things mean, what it means to be your funds at risk, what source of funds, how important that is, that you had possession and control of them, before you invested. In other cases, I've seen people like their parents or somebody would directly invest into their business from their personal account. So it didn't go to the applicant. So they never had possession and control of that money. And again, comes up to at risk. So, that's why I say it's really important. If you're going to be doing this, you're going to be spending all this time and money and resources to open a business in the United States and get an e-visa. Make sure you're doing it correctly. Hire somebody, consult with somebody who knows all of these things and the intricacies, the ins and outs of what could be problematic and how to deal with that through the process.
Well, Steven, thanks so much for your time today. I know we're working to build you into the process for our visa franchise clients, helping with the interview prep. How can people get in contact with you if they're looking to engage your services directly?
Oh, thank you. I have a website. It's Lawsorio Consulting. That's LAWSORIO Consulting. And you can also reach me directly via email at info@lasorioconsulting.com. Those are the two best ways to get a hold of me. You can also call me on my phone or text me 416-319-2133.
Awesome. Steven Lawson, thanks so much for joining. It was an absolute pleasure. I learned a lot. I'm sure our whole audience did too.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.